Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and I'm out on the range where I come to make peace with some of my previous decisions that might not have been very good, but I was thinking about a big problem regarding cheap AR-15s that a lot of people don't seem to mention or even talk about at all. And it is something that I think is worth discussing, especially right now where a lot of people are struggling economically. And if you're struggling economically, there's a good chance that you're looking for a more budget-friendly AR-15 if you find having a rifle like this one to be important for preparedness purposes. But this issue is something that you have to consider before jumping in head first to building or buying something from one of these more budget-friendly brands. Because if you're like me, you've had economic struggles in the past, and financially recovering from those struggles required some options that weren't necessarily what you wanted to do, but maybe what you had to do. Now, I do want to mention that Midway USA is the biggest supporter of the channel. Thanks to them, I'm able to come out here, give you this information, talk about AR-15s and other cool gun stuff with you. So I appreciate Midway USA for supporting what I do here. Now, here's the thing. I have zero issue with budget AR-15s. I think they need to be vetted, and I think that any issues need to be troubleshooted so you could fix them and get back on the range and get to work, right? And I like that more and more people can have access to the AR-15 platform thanks to some of these more budget-friendly companies that are out there, right? But the big issue that people don't tell you that I've faced personally that I think is worth considering when it comes to buying the cheapest possible option out there is that those rifles don't maintain any value once you take them off the shelf or order them offline or assemble them yourself. And so all the money invested into that platform because of, being on a budget or just wanting to try things out is not able to be recuperated at any point in the future, or at least not on any level that's worth doing. So what do I mean by that? Well, for example, back in the day, before I even started this channel, I was living in the Bay Area of California, right? And things were tough. I could not afford to live where I was living anymore. I had to change jobs, things were getting a little dicey. And for a while, I was working, but just not making enough money to make ends meet. So once a month, basically like clockwork, I had to sell a gun in order to afford rent. And that was unfortunate because my collection at the time wasn't very big to begin with, and then it dwindled pretty quickly. But those guns and the value that they maintained allowed me to get myself out of a tough position when it came to struggling financially. And without those guns, I might not have been able to get through for as long as I did in order to relocate to North Dakota where I am now and create a much better quality of life for my family and I. So I always look at guns as having some level of investment value, right? They have the ability to provide you with an ROI if necessary, right? And you might take a loss, and generally you do. They don't generally appreciate unless they become collectible for some reason, but they still hold value to a degree that allows you to access some of that initial investment during a difficult time. And the problem is, and this is from experience as well, when you go out and you build or buy something like a Bear Creek Arsenal or a Palmetto State Armory or even an Aero Precision or some of these more budget-friendly brands, they don't have the brand name recognition to have that same level of value when it comes to offloading it via a third party, or especially if you try to offload it at a gun shop, a pawn shop, or a big box store. If you've ever tried to sell a Bear Creek Arsenal locally, I would assume you took quite a loss, unless you just didn't explain what you were selling to the person who bought it, right? And at the same time, if you've ever tried to take one into a gun shop and maybe trade it in or just sell it flat out for cash, I'm sure the offer that you were given was disappointing, to say the least, right? And so even though you might only have to spend $400 or $500 to get an AR-15, which is a good thing, right? I think that's excellent. We need more people to have access to these guns. It does remove the possibility of recuperating some of those funds in the future, or at least without taking heavy losses. And as someone who's had to sell guns in the past in order to get through difficult financial situations, and understanding that currently we are in a very difficult economic time, I think it's something that you should be aware of before you spend $400 or $500, and then a month or two later find yourself in an emergency situation where you really need additional funds, and then you find out that that rifle cannot provide you with them. Whereas, had you bought a Smith & Wesson M&P2 or maybe a Ruger AR-556 or something that has brand name recognition, but still is in that budget entry level category of an AR-15, that would probably be able to get you back more of the money you initially invested. And I don't hear anybody talk about this, so that's why I'm addressing it. I'm not putting down those entry level or budget tiered AR manufacturers by any means. I think they have their place, and I think that, like I said, it's a good thing that Americans of all different financial capabilities can afford to own America's rifle and do what they need to do with it in the sense of defending themselves, their home, and their community in the future, right? But I just think those people should be aware of the fact that that 400 or 500 they spent is gone. And if they ever try to get any money back out of that project or out of that purchase, we're talking most likely at minimum like a 40% loss, right? So I think at least right now in these current times, because people are buying at that level in order to afford themselves what it is they need while also still being manageable in the sense of a financial option, they need to be aware of the fact that that's not going to benefit them in the future if that ever comes up, right? And I know a lot of people are in the comments right now are going to say, you should never sell your guns. Your first mistake was selling guns. Your first mistake was this or that. Look, man, I'm sorry, but I'm always going to prioritize my family having a roof over their head or being able to eat or paying my electric bill over keeping this rifle, right? Like that's where your priorities should be, right? I mean, we understand the importance of having these tools, but if you're at rock bottom, like this is not as important as being able to put some food on the table, right? So like these are things that at least should be considered. And I think a lot of people who are buying these really cheap ARs aren't well informed about all the other nuances to gun ownership, right? Like these people are usually beginners because that's kind of where they're getting started. And if they don't have this information, they might be disappointed later on when they try to get themselves out of a sticky situation. Another issue that's revolving around the same exact concept, the value of these guns basically being non-existent, is that if you ever eventually get to the point where you want to upgrade, right? Maybe you can't afford to buy like a BCM like this one or a Daniel Defense or, an FN or whatever. Maybe you can't afford to buy one flat out, but maybe you know that's something that you want because you've drained on your PSA or your Anderson or whatever it is, and you've put a lot of time in and you realize what it is you might be missing out on and that you want to try something from a little bit of a higher end, higher quality tier. Well, taking that PSA or whatever it is to the gun shop and trying to trade it in order to get some of that money back towards another purchase is also going to be disappointing. Whereas a gun shop seeing you bring in a factory complete Smith & Wesson MMP2 or a Ruger AR-556 or anything along those lines, even a Diamondback DB15, right? They see that brand name, they understand that it's from the factory. That's easier for them to sell to the next purchaser, which means they're more willing to take a risk on it in order to get it off of your hands and allow you to get as much value as possible out of it towards that next purchase. But if, what you have is an amalgamation of Anderson, Palmetto State Armory, and Bear Creek Arsenal, and you have a Frankenstein AR-15 that ran you $400, it's just barely not even worth bringing in at that point. And in fact, a lot of gun shops will just flat out deny you because they know they're not going to be able to sell that to anybody. So, like I said, this is not saying that AR-15s that cost $400 are bad. Like this is not the point of that video. And in fact, I think they're good because it does help lower the overall market value in the sense of trying to bring prices down while still getting people in the door that couldn't afford to otherwise. And of course, as long as people like hopefully myself in some degree, but also many of you here in the community can help those people troubleshoot any issues they might have due to the higher probability of QC problems, right? Well, then they can get out on the range, get their training in and have a way to defend themselves and not be breaking the bank in the process. So these are good things for us to have access to, but without the knowledge of the fact that that thing you just bought for $400 is not going to even get you close to $400 later if you need it, is something that I think those people should also have before making that decision. And if somebody's worried about whether or not they will need to get that money back possibly because of things being tight, but they also understand it's really important to have an AR-15, well, those people might be better off spending a little extra and getting the MMP2 or the AR-556 or whatever the name brand is that you can come up with off the top of your head that might have some resale value thereafter, because it will be a little bit of a safer bet for them to get some of those funds back if need be. And that's just what I wanted to bring up. Like I said, I don't hear people talk about this a lot. I haven't talked about it before, or not really, at least in the sense of a dedicated concept about it. But I thought it was worth having this conversation because right now people are struggling, things are hard, and I think that getting into an AR-15 for $400 is cool. But I also want to make sure that person understands that that AR will not be worth $400 after they buy it, or after they assemble it, or after they acquire it, however. So, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. That's just been my experience. And look, I've sold ARs that were PSA, I've sold Bear Creek Arsenal stuff, I've sold all kinds of budget entry-level stuff in the past in order to work my way up and build my way up towards more expensive and higher quality options. But in that process, I learned very quickly that those guns have no value in certain aspects. And maybe someone else doesn't have to learn that the hard way now that I was able to share that information. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you want to support the channel, go to magicprepper.com. There's options there for you. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.